Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bordeaux Show. Welcome and welcome. This is an ongoing exploration of the famed region and its wines. I'm Ron Edwards, Master Sommelier and Director of Wine Education here at Winebow, and I am riding shotgun with TJ because this is his journey, and we're glad of it. We invite you to place any questions or comments into the Q&A as we will not be managing the chat window. Let me introduce your host, certified Bordeaux educator TJ Griffin. TJ has held many jobs within the wine industry, from hospitality to wholesale. Throughout his career, what he enjoyed most was learning about wine and then sharing that knowledge with others. As the corporate wine educator for Winebow, he now enjoys that privilege of doing what he loves full time. And now, to discuss today's topic, the concepts of cru and terroir, TJ Griffin. Well, hello, TJ.
Hi, Ron. Happy Fat Tuesday.
Yes, I had my partial Krispy Kreme donut this morning in lieu of a punchki because I did not have a punchki available here in Richmond that I knew of. I'm sure there's one somewhere, but I didn't go looking very, very closely. How about you?
No, I have nothing of the sort, unfortunately, today, so I'm gonna have to live vicariously through others.
You can just imagine the flavor of fried fat and sugar, and you're all set.
I think I'm familiar with those flavors. Yes.
Most of us are. So where are we going today, man?
All right. So today we're going to talk about the concepts of cru and terroir, which are very important to Bordeaux, specifically France in general, the old world in general as well, but very kind of hard to pin down. So I really would love to hear some questions and some commentary, and I'd love to hear people's opinions on different things. So,
I'm sure I'll share my opinion.
all right. So terroir. It's not a legally defined term. I mean, who would even attempt that, right?
The French would.
The
They,
French
they
might.
would, and they sort of have, but okay, keep going.
Uh, but it means different things to different people. Some people will cut it off as only nature. Some people go a little further, which we'll talk about in a second. I'm going to read a quick definition from The Science of Wine by Dr. Jamie Good, which is a fantastic book if you haven't had it, but I like his definition. The primary definition is that terroir is the possession by a wine of a sense of place. That is, the wine expresses flavor characteristics influenced by the properties of the vineyard or region from which it hails. So within that, there's a lot of different things we can talk about. He goes into an interesting discussion about terroir versus typicité and how they compare and contrast. We hear the French term goût de terroir, which literally means the taste, the flavors, presumed to be imparted by the individual vineyard site. But Ron, as we know, there is no scientific basis for the idea that actual flavor molecules are transmitted from the soil into the grape and then the wine. Although we have a lot of anecdotal evidence,
Mhm.
we just don't have the science. So that's a whole philosophical discussion. But I'm sure you've experienced that feeling, or that taste, or that sensation, as have I. But apparently, as far as we know now, no basis in actual science.
Yeah, there's some really interesting research going on in Canada, sponsored by John Szabo and a fellow and a scientist from one of the universities, to try and start pinning down the actual science behind um, at least minerality, which is one of the major sort of conversation points of terroir. When we talk about Chablis and we say, "Oh, it's so chalky seashell," we actually do interpret those flavors nearly universally in the same way. So there must be something there, right? The question is, what is it? And at least the direction they're heading is that this concept we're about to talk about is a group of factors that change what's going into the fermentation vat, and therefore how it all comes out on the other side is different chemistry than it would be from somewhere else. So, uh, um, you know, I think that's where the science is heading now. But that's a big I think. I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, and I don't play a scientist on TV, so you can't really trust me on this. But that's what I've heard.
Well, John Sabo, or Sao, I don't know how you pronounce his name exactly, but he's written the definitive book on volcanic wines. I believe it's called Volcanic Wines.
Mm.
Um, and he is the expert. So it's exciting to hear that he's doing that. For me, it was a volcanic wine that uh, talk outside of Bordeaux. It was an Alianico from Basilicata called from a winery called Bisceglia, and it grows on the slopes of Mount Volturre, and it tastes ashy. It tastes volcanic, and I don't know why that is. It's over my head. I did not stay at a Holiday Inn either,
Mm.
so I can't explain it. But there's something there. So I'd love to see what he comes up with. All right. So before we get into the components of terroir, the elements of terroir, we have to talk about geography, right? So geography, where you're located, not just latitude, but also longitude, is really going to determine a lot about what your climate is, right? Which will then determine what your terroir is to a large extent. So before we get to um, before we get to that, we have to talk about geography. So the 45th parallel north is where Bordeaux is, and a lot of other famous regions are there. Think of the Piedmont, the Piemonte in Italy, the Northern Rhone in France, not too far away, the Willamette Valley. And I don't know how to pronounce this, Ron, but I figured I'd mention this because you're probably the expert on this. The Leelanau Peninsula in Michigan.
That was pretty close. Yeah, Leelanau Peninsula in Michigan is on the 45th, as is the Old Mission Peninsula, which is a slightly smaller region but slightly better, and both within 15 miles of each other. Right
So
on the 45th.
there's something to be said. I mean, the belts are really from 30 degrees to 50 degrees in the northern and southern hemisphere, but there seems to be a lot at around the 45. I suspect in Europe it's a lot to do with history and where the Romans went, but that's a different discussion. But
I
longitude can matter as well. If you think about, Chile, for example, is a great example of longitude because if a lot of the terroir or your climate will be determined on your proximity to either the cool Pacific Ocean or the Andes or somewhere in between.
Mhm.
So longitude is not to be ignored either.
Nope, and it certainly is a factor with Bordeaux. It's on the 45th parallel, but because of where it is on the longitude Latin, well, is it longitude or is it just where it is landmass wise, right? Because
Right.
Bordeaux's right on the coast, whereas Piemonte is essentially a continental climate with a little bit of Mediterranean influence coming up from the south. So those are very different. Because we were talking about this before the broadcast about, well, Nova Scotia's on the 45th parallel too.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see anybody growing Cabernet in Nova Scotia yet, but maybe they will. And the big difference is weather pattern moving west to east, right? So in Nova Scotia, the west to east pattern is bringing in Arctic wind, and in the west east pattern for the Bordeaux region, it's bringing in weather that's been moderated temperature wise, at least by the large heat sink, etc., of the Atlantic Ocean. So never too terribly cold, nah, very rarely terribly hot.
Yeah, they make wine in Nova Scotia, but I don't know what grapes, and I haven't had any.
Mm.
But maybe I'll make that a mission this week to try a Nova Scotia wine. So this, of course, if you remember your studies, is the periodic table of the elements of terroir, which everyone learns, I believe, in high school, right? No, this is made up, but it talks about what the elements of terroir could be. Not everybody would include all. Some of these are universally agreed upon. Some of them are a little more controversial, which we'll get into. But I grouped them by family. So you have your climate, which is temperature and precipitation. You have your sunlight, which is really solar radiation. Topography, including elevation, slope, and aspect. You have your geology, which is soils. And soil, two components to soils: the physical characteristics of the soil and also the chemical characteristics, what it's made of. You have hydrology, which is really important, soil water relations, and then humans, which we'll see um, how we feel about that. So, climate, temperature, precipitation. Bordeaux is classified, as you were just talking about, as a temperate oceanic climate. Other wine regions that are in that classification are Vienna in Austria, Auckland in New Zealand, and Hobart in Tasmania, Australia. So very different wines coming out of those areas. So again, a factor, but not the whole factor. Bordeaux climate's pretty mild, and there's, as one uh, book put it, there's no dry season. You can get rain or pretty much year round. Heavy precipitation mostly in the winter, which is mild. Average temps during the growing season were in the mid to high 60s, but they often get up into the high 70s or even warmer. Lows are in the mid 50s. So that's an interesting thing because when we talk about the great wine regions of the world, one thing they often have in common is a big diurnal shift between the daytime high and the nighttime low. And that's just not the case with Bordeaux. It does go down about 10 degrees, so but it's not a dramatic shift like you see in some other regions. Uh, Average about 2 inches of rain a month during the growing season, 11 or 12 wet days in a month. And then we'll talk about sunlight in a sec. But this is an important thing to talk about because these are concepts that are very important in viticulture. We divide the climate into three subdivisions: the macroclimate, the mesoclimate, and the microclimate. As you can see here, the macroclimate is, the climate of a large region, Bordeaux. There's some uniformity, there's some generality we can talk about, and those are all the things that affect climate in general. Sunlight, wind, rain, temperature, all that stuff. The mesoclimate is much smaller. It can be, in some people's opinions, as large as a subregion, for like example, Pauillac, or it could be as small as an individual vineyard. Um, and that's influenced a lot more by things like the elevation, the slope, the aspect of the vineyard, wind breaks, proximity to water, ground cover. Um, for macroclimate, there's nothing, or at least very, very little that you can do to change that or to mitigate the effects of that. Mesoclimate, you can do a little bit more because you can, especially if you're choosing the site of your vineyard, that's important to work with the mesoclimate. But once your vineyard's established, there's not a ton you can do at the mesoclimate level other than maybe some soil amelioration. The microclimate is where we really get down small. We're talking about the area from the soil up through the vine canopy around a plant. This is an area that's affected by the soil water relations, by the temperature, by the sunlight or lack thereof, by the airflow within the canopy. And this has a high degree of influence from viticultural practices. You can really do a lot with the microclimate. So that's where the human influence might come in. Sunlight, super important for grape ripening, right? The two things that will ripen a grape: temperature and sunlight. Solar radiation. The temperature of the grape berry is largely determined by sunlight, not the warmth of the air. That does have an effect, but it's more sunlight that will affect that. And that's where you get a lot of the flavor, a lot of the complexity directly from the temperature of the berry during the growing season. In Bordeaux, get about 8 hours of sunlight on average during the growing season. Not a ton. Sunlight intensity is moderate. Over the course of the year, it's about 45% of the time sunny. The rest is, rainy or cloudy or, low sunshine, haze. And you see that a lot in Bordeaux. You see that if you Google Bordeaux pictures, you see that a lot. And that's what I think people think of as Bordeaux. So not the sunniest region, but certainly there's days where there's great, great sunshine.
So this is one of those topics that's also highly related to latitude, right?
Hmm.
And so, in the concept of terroir, the amount of sunlight you get every day is going to increase the further north or south you go beyond the equator. And so, one of the reasons that all of our vines are in that 30 to 50 band is that those are the number of hours of sunlight preferred by the plant in general. And when you start looking at um, how do you make up for like the lack of overall heat intensity of say the Mosel, right? It's fairly cool there. They make up for it with 12 and a half hours of sunlight in June or more. And in the case of Bordeaux, one of the reasons that Bordelais wines are not as ripe as they might be at that latitude is what you brought up otherwise, cloud cover, and one of the reasons that the uh, pyrazinic qualities of Cabernet and its cousins from Bordeaux stay around is cloud cover. Whereas when we move sunlight out of Bordeaux and put it in someplace like, I don't know, Mendoza, and you put Cabernet there, there's so much UV light that destroys the pyrazinic compounds. So those wines struggle to taste of that herbal side of Cabernet Sauvignon without shading from the canopy. So sunlight's a big deal. And we as humans can affect how much sunlight those grapes get by canopy management.
Hmm.
On we go.
Yeah, Mosel. I was thinking also of Marlborough, New Zealand.
Mhm.
Quite cool, but really long days and bright, sunny, lots of sunlight. So you get, but those wines are noticeably pyrazinic, which is my new favorite word. For those who don't know what pyrazinic means, pyrazines in grapes, specifically the Bordeaux varieties, like Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Carmenere, Cabernet Franc. It's that sort of bell peppery, vegetal, herbal that is prized by many, but avoided by some. Is
Mhm.
that fair to say?
Okay.
All right, so topography, the lay of the land, right? The elevation, the aspect, the way that the vineyard faces, the slope, the degree of slope going up, and if we're talking about the left bank, we're talking about pretty low elevation. I think the highest elevation around 145 feet is what I found on the left bank. Pauillac, you're getting up these gravel mounds. They call them croup. The highest point in Pauillac, I believe, is 100 feet, which I think is the highest in the Médoc. Um, in the right bank, you're having a little more traditional topography. You're having more hills and plateaus, a little more varied and a lot higher. The highest elevation on the right bank is in Saint-Emilion at over 320 feet, so significantly different. The lowest elevation in Bordeaux is actually a little bit below sea level. So we're talking, it's not a very high region. So again, that kind of explains the lack of a huge diurnal temperature shift, which of course goes up in elevation, and it also explains a little bit the weather. So
Yep.
geology. Uh, it's this is where we get into generalities. So everyone says, oh, on the left bank, it's the well-drained gravel soils. I love Cabernet. On the right bank, you have clay and limestone. And yeah, sure, that's true. But in the left bank, mixed in with the gravel, there's everything you see in the right bank as well. Sometimes there's within the gravel, there's a lot of sand and silt. You have clay deposits on the right bank. You have plenty of gravel as well, and in addition to the limestone and the clay, and you also have some iron-rich soils too in Saint-Emilion. So and we talk about entre deux mers, between the two regions, it's a mix of everything. And same thing as we go down to Sauternes and Barsac, very varied soil. So yes, in general, left bank gravel, right bank clay and limestone. And yes, to an extent, that determines where the grapes have been planted, because of course, we'll talk about more next week when we get into grape varieties, but Merlot prefers the cooler, damp soils of clay-based soils, and Cabernet Sauvignon, which does not like to get its feet wet, prefers the warmer, well-draining soils made of gravel. But the soils of Bordeaux are a lot more varied than I think people give it credit for. Speaking of well-draining, hydrology, this is one of the most important aspects of soil. So when people talk about what the soil is and what's important, they focus on the minerals in the soil. That's what they tend to focus on the most. And really what they should be focusing on is the soil water relations, and how that are they well drained? Do they drain a lot and then retain some? Like limestone is perfect for that. Chalky soils act like a sponge, and they will drain the soils, but they also retain some and give it back to the vine when they need it. So super important to know about the hydrology. And again, warmer, well-draining soils on the left bank, right bank a little more water retentive, between just about everything, south just about everything.
And you can't outweigh this conversation because it has so much to do with a lot of things, including not only is it what the vine has accessible to it for its own use, right? It's also how much water is laying around to cause other problems like mildew and rot and mold. And what are you going to do about that? And all of these things start to make decisions in the viticultural side, right? The idea of the French drain being in the vineyards of Bordeaux to make sure that that lower lying land on the in the Medoc is not holding water ridiculously and ballooning up these grapes unnecessarily, because, well, until the Dutch got there, it was too swampy for most things to grow or live, right? It was the other side of the river that was founded first. The Romans built over there because you don't build buildings in the swamp. So, it's a very interesting study of Bordeaux. And, there's so many different reasons that if you just look at it on the surface, it's not the world's greatest wine region, but then they drain it and all of a sudden it's fabulous. So it's a fascinating long-term study as opposed to what we see now.
Yeah, I found this picture, and I don't know if this water is going to disappear in an hour or so, but I think it would make me nervous if this was my vineyard. I'm like, "What? Go away, water!
Hmm.
I don't want you here in that amount."
Yep. Good reason for that cover crop. All those
Yes.
grasses eat up a lot of water. So
So this is where we get a little bit perhaps controversial about is this part of terroir? So here we have human influence, and also in this picture we have some horse influence.
Mhm.
Um, Certainly, there's decisions that are made in the vineyard that will affect the microclimate, especially, and to an extent the mesoclimate. But what about the winery? Ron and I, we had this conversation recently about the influence of the winery, about decisions made of things to do by the winemaker, of things not to do by the winemaker. We've made. We also talked about the microbiome of the winery and how that might affect a wine. So, is that terroir?
Yeah, I think it's most definitely terroir. And we talk about this a lot. And I look back to, I'm just barely old enough, or maybe some people would say I'm more than old enough, but I'm going to go with just barely old enough to go back into Bordeaux prior to its modern transformation through, uh, you know, one or two or three highly influential winemakers kind of changing the style of Bordeaux to the modern world, right? And when I first started trying Bordeaux and moving into Bordeaux as an idea, what was so often labeled as terroir was actually winery microorganisms, Brettanomyces or this or that or the other, that, and we're not even going to get into the discussion of whether you think that's a flaw or not. The point was, it was the signature of Bordeaux was some of the microbiology signature from the winery, not from the land, right? So it is very possible that we can eliminate those things, right? You renovate the winery, you clean it all out, you move to stainless steel tanks, you throw out all the barrels, you start over and change the microbiome of the winery. It's highly likely your wine will not taste the way it used to taste. Now, the question is it now more representative of the terroir from it's from, or was all of that microbiology part of the whole to begin with, right? You can probably make an argument on either side. I personally think with today's technology available to the viticulturalist as well as the winery personnel themselves, you have a choice. You can completely eradicate any sense of place that might be there through technology, through vineyard management, um, through winemaking technology, especially, or you can take a much less aggressive approach and try to let nature take its course and see what comes out. And then maybe the human influence is minimized, but it is a major factor because we're the ones making the decisions in most every step of this process.
And the decisions, as we were discussing, decisions are sometimes what not to do, or often what not to do, which is making a choice. When you could do something else, or you could guide it this way or guide it that way.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's the nature versus nurture argument, and I think you have to at least consider a little bit of the nurture there. All right, so very exciting right now. This is something new that we're going to try, and hopefully we'll do more of it. So we're going to have a special guest star today, Ron,
Woo!
because I think as we talk about terroir and what it is, what it's composed of, do you believe in it? Do you not believe in it? Should it include humans or should it not? there's a lot to talk about, and we can get really scientific about it. But what you can't do is divorce the idea of terroir from Bordeaux or France, period, from the wines, because it's part of their culture. It's ingrained in the culture. So to speak to that, we brought in our special guest star. Let me give a quick bio for Jessica. Jessica Hawkins Green, our lovely guest. She first developed an interest in wine while touring a vineyard during a high school abroad in France. She graduated from the University of Chapel Hill and then earned an MA in Renaissance Studies at Yale. She studied at the University of Bologna and later spent a year in the Chianti Classico region of Tuscany. For 5 years, she lived in the gastronomic capital of France, which you see here, Lyon. She's pursued a career in publishing as a book and magazine editor, a literary agent, now as a writer. Her articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, American Express publications, Beverage Dynamics, and the Somme Journal. She earned the WSET diploma in 2009, and at the International Wine Center in New York, she teaches all levels of the WSET from level 1 through diploma. And she's currently a student in the Master of Wine program. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, TJ. Thank you so much for having me on today. I've been a fan of this webinar series. I'm learning a lot from you.
So tell us a little bit about your experience, perhaps through the lens of wine, but also through the lens of just being a person living in Lyon, what your experience was with the French and this concept of terroir.
Sure. Well, I love your idea that you can't take the concept out of France. They believe in it at body and soul. It's one of the first things they talk about when people, if I tell people I lived in France, they say where? And then if I say Lyon, then they say, oh, the gastronomic capital of the world, like you just said. And they immediately start listing foods you might have there. They associate flavor intensely with place. And for example, today it's Fat Tuesday, as you said, or Mardi Gras, or Shrove Tuesday, and in Lyon there's an extremely important flavor in today. They call them bugnes, and they eat them in Savoie too, but they started in Lyon, and they're a little delicious fried pastry with powdered sugar, and they make a big mess everywhere, and you have to eat them this day. And so one of the things somebody would say to you today in Lyon would be like, have you had any bugnes? Would you like some bugnes? Really important. So they love to associate flavor with place. It's absolute. And every place has its best flavor. So if you want the best wine, for example, you probably, Bordeaux is probably the most famous, but also Burgundy, Beaujolais, everyone has its own wines. And here you have pictures of beautiful foods that are the best in these places. So I love this slide you made. So up on the right, that's Nyon, and that's the place for olives. So for example, if you said to someone, I'm going on vacation, I rented a house in Nyon, they would say, oh, les olives, oh, they're so delicious. You can only get olives from there. If you're at the market anywhere in France, if you don't get them from Nyon, why would you bother eating them? And chicken, especially chicken. Maybe one of the most famous examples, les poulets de Bresse. You have to have les poulets de Bresse, les poulets de Bresse. If you see poulet on a menu in Lyon and it doesn't say poulet de Bresse, you won't order it because those are the best chickens. You have to have those chickens. And same with these lentils. I was taking my boys on a weekend to Puy de Dôme, and everyone said, oh, les lentilles, bring me back some lentilles. So lentils from Puy, if you're gonna eat lentils, they have to be from Puy because those are the best lentils. And I do really enjoy what Ron said, that it's so much more than just where the thing grows. It's also how it's been cultivated for years, and that you can count on the producers of lentils from Puy to do the right thing. Just like with Comté cheese, there's a whole recipe, and you have to get the milk from the cow into the vat in a certain amount of time at a certain temperature, or it can't be Comté. So it's so much more than just place. It's also how you make the thing.
Yeah, well, these all have their own AOCs, right? They have the appellations for different agricultural products, which, just like in wine, have certain things you can and cannot do, right? So that there are ways you have to do it to be the traditional. So what, as a wine expert, as a gastronomic lover, what was your experience? What do you think about terroir? Did you find that this goût de terroir existed for you in French, and the wines and the food? Do you like the notion as a romantic idea, or do you think there's something factual based to it?
I totally believe it. I wish there were a scientific explanation for it. I'm always bothered when people come up with silly experiments to prove it doesn't exist. Well, like Randall Graham, of whom I'm a big fan, when he put rocks into his wines, I think that's silly. But I think what Ron said, for example, um, about Chablis, we all feel the chalkiness in Chablis. It's not, I don't believe that the chalk jumps out of the soil into the glass or that the winemakers put chalk in the glass, but something about wine made in Chablis gives you a chalky flavor. And you can get that same chalky flavor in Sancerre, which has the same subsoil. So something is real there. We don't understand it well because we're not scientists, we're enologists, but I wish we did. And I do believe that it's there. I do believe, and I think that there is more and more science on it. For example, I was thinking of you, TJ, this week. There was a study that came out in Argentina where they love to dig the soil pits and then they love to study, but they studied different patches of terroir vinified with the same clone, the same vigneron, the same irrigation assist, everything the same. And you could absolutely microbiologically tell the plots apart. So it does exist. How it happens is a mystery, but I believe it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you're. Sorry, go ahead, Ron.
That's okay. That study came out from the Catena Institute. And as usual, Laura is doing her very best to remind the world that everywhere has terroir. It's not just a French thing or an Italian thing or a Swiss thing or this, it's an everywhere thing. And she's definitely on a mission based on her love of European wines as well to justify the idea that New World regions have sense of place as well, which is the influence of man issue, right? Are we allowing it to speak? And that's true everywhere. Are you allowing the sense of place to speak?
Absolutely, which can definitely include a little bit of funkiness. I mean, living in the Rhone, I'm with Ron, like a little bit of that Brett, that's part of terroir. It was a bready place. And if you take it all out, it doesn't taste so Rhone-y to me. I like a little bit of Brett. I'm happy with that.
So by the way, I have a couple of questions and comments
sure.
that came up, TJ. This is a good time because I think the two of you should address this. The first one was from Antonio, and Antonio brought up the idea that there isn't just only terroir, there's also merroir, the idea of the entire environment under which your seafood was brought to life and to your table. If you want to touch on that between the two of you, and then there's one here from Mario that we can address.
I love that idea, don't you, TJ?
I've read about it. I don't know much about it. I couldn't speak to it, but absolutely. I mean, how much of the world is covered by oceans? A lot more than is covered by land, and we don't. I don't know if this is still true, but the old saying, we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the ocean's depths. But certainly, I would believe that merroir would be definitely.
Absolutely. I mean, think of when we eat a lot of salmon in my household, and my kids can always tell whether it's like Scottish or Patagonian or farmed. Or, they have really different flavors.
Yeah, I'll give you personal experience there as a fisherman growing up with my father. One of the fish that we seek is redfish or red drum, sometimes it's called in the US. And they are a fish that runs in and out of ocean waters and up into estuary creeks where it starts to go from salt to brackish. They won't go past the brackish. They don't really like to get very much into fresh. But as you can imagine, when you get in, you're in free run ocean and then you get into brackish water or estuaries, the water clarity and everything else is completely different, right? So your sawgrass creeks and everything in eastern North Carolina tend to be brown from the silt that's running around. And out in the ocean, especially the time of year that they're along the beaches, it's fairly clear most of the time. And you can tell the difference in the fish flavor wise when you've caught them ocean run versus creek run, especially if you don't take the skin off. If you take the skin off, they actually can have that sort of muddy, silty flavor profile that's because it's stuck to them, right? But out in the ocean, they're much cleaner and the flavor of the flesh is much more vibrant, for lack of a better description, even if it's a bit descriptive using flesh. So here's the next one, and then we'll move on for interest of time. But so Mario is sort of making a comment. Am I wrong in thinking that terroir is a Burgundian concept? In Bordeaux, you hear very seldom about terroir, only by agronomists, but in the Côte d'Or, it's always what they're talking about? Is it because wines were always made by farmers, not by noble families? And I think TJ and I, you and I, and I'm sure Jessica could join in this conversation for sure, had this conversation leading into the webinar. So have at it. Mario's listening.
Yeah. So great point about Burgundy and the the monks, and they're keeping records for hundreds of years, detailed records. We planted this in this spot and we liked it, and we didn't like this, and then we moved it over here and we liked it better, and this is the best spot for that, and this is the best spot for that, and this has the level of detail there is probably greater than maybe anywhere else in Western Europe. But there were monks all over Western Europe. There were monks in Bordeaux and in Germany, and so perhaps the first notions of terroir maybe were birthed in Burgundy. But interesting thing, I told Ron this anecdote the other day. I was a little bit skeptical of Bordeaux and terroir at one point because I always think of it as such a branded appellation, a branded region. But and I asked somebody who would be considered an expert, I guess, and he agreed with me. He said, "Oh, well, yeah, Burgundy is about terroir and Bordeaux is about branding." And certainly branding, as we'll talk about later on in this webinar series, is very important to Bordeaux. But they are very much focused on terroir. And Jane Anson, who's probably, arguably, the biggest expert in Bordeaux, is a very passionate exponent of how they're expressing terroir, how they're trying to get back to terroir, and how they're trying to get that word out to people about the terroir. And I haven't read it yet, but her new book, Inside Bordeaux, I believe, gets heavily into that. So I'm looking forward to reading that. What would you guys say to that question?
Jessica, you first.
I wanted to hear what you were going to say, because you said you guys had talked about it before.
Well, the reality for me is that Bordeaux is always going to struggle to convince the public that they are a terroir-driven region, because they have set themselves up for the last 200 years as a brand-specific entity. That said, the brands are from places that are relatively consistently the same. Okay, so yes, maybe they've bought some property, but they're still in Pauillac, right? Or they expanded a little bit. They're not, Petrus is not the same size viticulturally as it was in 1975. So there is that battle to take, right? And the Grand Cru of Burgundy are the exact same size they've always been. There's been no exchange of land. Some maybe goes fallow, but there's no new stuff. It definitely is. It's present, right? It's definitely present. Pauillac doesn't taste like Margaux in general. The influence of man is more readily accessible in the wines of Bordeaux because of the winemaking style. And that's a decision they'll make over the course of time, I'm sure, is if they're serious about getting back to pure expressions of terroir, they'll make decisions in winemaking to get out of the way. If they are perfectly happy with their very high scores by critics and the sales that they're getting at the prices they're asking, then why would they change? So I think there's both economics and philosophy going on here in Bordeaux. There's only one philosophy in Burgundy. Sense of place is all there is. And it's duplicated in the Mosel and in other regions in Germany, right? Where it's down to not just a hillside, but a little slice of a hillside. And we could talk about that some other time, but it's fascinating how the hydrology of those hillsides function in the cliff sides of Germany that turn those little bitty plots into different things. Jessica?
I so agree with that. And I had a feeling you would express that better than I would about our impression of Bordeaux is about brands, and even more than brands, about very grand properties, that we think of the beautiful castle and we think of a prestigious bottle and label, and that those have been the same for a long time. But when you study wine, one of the first things you learn is that in Burgundy, the map never changes. If it's Clos des Mouches, it's going to be Clos des Mouches tomorrow. It was Clos des Mouches 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it was Clos des Mouches, because that's where the flies gather around and the really ripe grapes. But in Bordeaux, if I buy a new patch of land, I can still call it Chateau Jessica because it's my chateau. But I think the deeper truth that Ron is getting at is what TJ, you probably learned when you were in Bordeaux, and I experienced in Bordeaux, is that when you do have the great opportunity to taste Bordeaux from different appellations, I mean, forget Chateau, but when you taste a Pauillac against a Margaux for the first time carefully, and you say, they're totally different. Yes, I can taste that the Pauillac is much more dense and concentrated and powerful. And I can taste that and smell that the Margaux is much more expressive aromatically and much sort of softer and more ethereal. That's real. That's terroir. That's you can't buy and sell that. That's real. And it's step to step. I remember getting clay on my shoes, and the winemaker was like, "There you go. Wipe off the clay and remember that. Like we have a lot of clay here. It makes it different than Pauillac. It makes our wines taste different, and I believe it does. I think it's really important in Bordeaux, even though Burgundians will say they have a monopoly. The Bordelais have it too."
Well said. And that is a very good lead in to this concept of cru or growth, or, so in a future webinar, we'll talk about the classification system, but the classification systems, plural, of Bordeaux, there's more than one. But this idea that a site is better than another site. We can talk about the 1855 classification of the left bank, and we have the 5 classes, the premier cru, the deuxième cru. Those were established by negociants primarily, who said, well, this is the wine that we'll pay the highest for. These are the grapes we'll pay the highest for. This is another one that we'll pay, good money for. This one, we'll pay pretty good money, but not as much as these. And that's how it was classed. So these had already been established prior to that classification as, this is a great vineyard, this is a great vineyard, this is a great chateau. Ron and I were talking about, or as you touched on, Jessica, you can purchase. So if you are a second growth and I'm a third growth, and you buy one of my vineyards, all of a sudden that vineyard is a second growth, technically, because it's the chateau that's classified, not the vineyards. Nothing changed in the vineyards. So what does that say about terroir? And that was my big question. And I asked that to Jane Anson, and she said, well, it's not done as much as you would think. It's usually the other way, from a second down to third, or a third to a fourth, or so, et cetera, et cetera. But also, if it is done going up, it's usually reserved for a second wine, or it's not as controversial as you might think. So I like that answer. But Ron and I were talking about this idea that these sites, these chateaux, were the best even 150, 160 years ago, or 200 years ago. And pardon me if I misquote you, Ron, but you were saying something to the effect of, if these chateaux got more money for their grapes, they got to invest more in their properties, and the little guys didn't get that. So you had they're making leaps and bounds exponentially in terms of their quality because they can afford it. Does that summarize kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, it's the chicken or the egg concept, right? And the use of available technology and knowledge at the time was limited to the time. Just like we are now, we have way more knowledge and availability of technology than we did 200 years ago to manage a piece of ground and make wine from it. And that piece of ground that used to be too difficult to manage because it had too much humidity, or it had this, or it had that, is now perfectly manageable and capable of making really, really good wine because we've made it so. Well, a lot of that ability has been brought along by the availability of funds for reinvestment, right? And so the more wealth you can bring in off of your property, the more you can reinvest, the more likely your property is to either maintain or increase in quality offering in the wine world. Better winemaking equipment, better talent, better everything. And so, to say that a fifth growth in 1855 was never going to be capable of being more than a fifth growth eternally doesn't fit the model of progression. And so today, I guess the easiest way for me to put it in summary is that, sure, there's a difference between first and fifth growth qualitatively, but it's much smaller than it was 200 years ago. We're talking about a very thin slice, because not too many people will taste a good vintage of Lynch Bosch and go, that's bottom of the barrel classified growth. What are you talking about? No, crazy. Or a great vintage of Leo Velasquez and say, oh yes, the first growths are definitely better than that. No, they're not. They're just not. It's just very, very close quarters of quality now.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It reminded me, if anyone out there has read The Tipping Point with Malcolm Gladwell, he talks about the Canadian hockey players, and all the best of the best were born between January and March, because they were the oldest kids. That was the cutoff for age. So they were the oldest kids in the team. They were a little bit bigger. They got a little bit more attention from the coach. They got more playing time. And over time, that adds up so that they're the best players as adults. But they got the attention. And it's a great point about the Chateau as well.
I think they even used to calculate the amount of millions you could put into a chateau if you got one Parker star or point, how many millions that was worth that you could pump back in, and then your wine would get that much better.
Yeah, never underestimate the power of a 95. And
well, I don't. We can talk more. We can talk more about it when we get to the classifications, but I don't see, at least in my lifetime or more, that the classifications will change, at least in the left bank, because there's too many people too invested in it as it is right now. But great points. Maybe it's to our benefit that we have some of those sneakily good other class, because then we can afford them. Because I don't know if you can afford if you guys are regularly drinking first growths. I'm not, but.
I've only drunk first growths at the behest of somebody else who was generous. Never bought one on my own.
No, my husband talks about buying Bordeaux in Britain 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You could really get great Bordeaux for a song before the world discovered that there were so many good ones that were not top growth.
Pre-Chinese market, pre-1982 scores.
Yeah, I used to work with a guy who went to Yale, speaking of Yale, and got into wine in college. And so it was probably 40 years ago-ish. And you could buy, anything for $10, $15, $20. Burgundy, Bordeaux. Not anymore. All right. That was great. Thank you for the conversation, guys. That was perfect. Any comments or questions from the crowd, Ron?
We've covered the questions that have been submitted, and they seem to be happy with what we've said so far. They're all going to go now out into the world and have arguments about Bordeaux and Terroir and who's right and who's wrong. And that's just the way it should be, if you ask me.
Yes, we like to provoke some thoughtful arguments in the world of wine. So go forth and argue.
There you go. That's correct.
And eat donuts, right?
Eat donuts and argue and have a glass of Sauterne all at the same time. Wouldn't that be great?
Yes.
A punchy and a Sauterne. That sounds great. And actually, I didn't think about this. I had some friends over Friday night, and they brought a half bottle of Sudero, and there's some left in the fridge.
I had some in the fridge too, Ron. There must be
DJ's left out.
I don't have any in the fridge.
DJ, it might be time to pop some open.
Yes, donuts and Sauterne. What a wonderful way to celebrate Fat Tuesday. I'm on it.
Me too. And argument.
All right, TJ, thank you for your time and your investment in getting this rolling and putting together the presentation every week. I love riding on your coattails for this one. It's a lot less work, and it's tons of fun. Jessica, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you
back sometime. We'll have you back sometime.
Thank you.
The energy was fabulous. And who wants to listen to a couple of old men all the time anyway? We gotta have a better voice. All right. And we will see you March 2nd at 11 a.m. Eastern time. Same bat channel, same Bordeaux grapes. And that will be our topic then. So thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.